Amen. All right, so if you've been with us for the last couple weeks, we started a sermon series called Silence and Solitude. In essence, silence and solitude simply means to make intentional time, to create intentional time in our everyday lives to be with God alone. Solitude is to create intentional time to be with God alone, and silence is to be quiet in the loving presence of God. I had mentioned last week that our culture and our generation is an endless cycle of just distractions. Our life, it feels like a continuous cycle of distractions. Our jobs, our careers, our relationships. We talked about our devices, our ambitions. It's just cycle after cycle, distraction after distraction, and it prevents us from giving our affection and devotion to God. And we said that the practice of silence and solitude, as we saw in the life of Jesus, the rhythms of retreating from busyness, the rhythms of retreating from his ministry, to practice silence and solitude breaks that pattern. It momentarily breaks that cycle for us to be able to be connected with God in order to live the abundant life. And I said to us, I am convinced that the most foundational practice, the most foundational spiritual discipline, and a spiritual discipline is just a means to an end, and the ends is to experience the love of God. That the goal is not the practice itself. The goal is not the discipline itself. But the end goal is to experience the love of God. And I had mentioned that silence and solitude, I believe, is the foundational practice that sets a relationship with God. And without it, it's just going to be an endless cycle of chasing after the next thing. I was watching the Oprah Winfrey, I don't know if it's the Oprah Winfrey show anymore, but on Apple TV, she does these interviews. One of my favorite actors is Will Smith. Anybody? Will Smith? I love Will Smith, fam. He's coming out with a new book called Will. Right? It's literally called Will. And it's a new memoir, and Oprah Winfrey interviews him for an hour and 15 minutes. And I watched the interview. Hey, fam, that interview was my message last week in summary. He talks about the false self, right? The false self is the artificial persona that you and I create as a means to find a sense of significance, belonging, and importance. And Will Smith goes on and says, I created Will Smith. I created this image because of my insecurity, and it's only now in my 50s, reaching 50s, now I know that's not who I really am. That's the false self I created because of my trauma. And I was like, yo, he's preaching my message. All truth is under God's truth. But there's a moment in the interview that I wanted to share with you guys to kind of, I guess, give an introduction to my 10-minute message. So watch this video with me. Excuse the quality. I recorded it with my iPhone, so the audio is a little ghetto. But if we could watch this video, that would be great. All right. Just in case you missed the context, the first 8 movies that Will Smith came out with were all #1 blockbusters. The first 8. But I Am Legend was the most watched movie in the history of the month of December in the world. And then they made $77 million in the first 3 days. And instead of celebrating, saying we just broke history, his immediate thought went to, why didn't it hit $80 million? Why didn't it hit $80 million? And here's my point today. I think the greatest threat to gratitude is discontentment. The antonym of gratitude is not sadness, it's being discontent. It's a heart that is so empty that it tries to fill itself, but it can't, and then lives in discontentment. And I read a quote this week by a guy named Richard Rohr, and it kind of embodies what Will Smith was sharing, but I think if we're honest with ourselves, what many of us are feeling. Check out this quote by Richard Rohr. He says, in this life, all symphonies remain unfinished. our deep longings are never really satisfied. What this means, among other things, is that we are not restful creatures who sometimes get restless, fulfilled people who sometimes are dissatisfied, serene people who sometimes experience disquiet. Rather, we are restless people who occasionally find rest. We are dissatisfied people who occasionally find fulfillment. We are disquieted people who occasionally find serenity or peace. We do not naturally default into rest, satisfaction, and quiet, but into their opposite. What a powerful quote. That we, by default, we are not restful people. But instead, by default, we are restless, and on occasion, we find rest. That's why some of us wake up tired. That's why some of us, our normal state is anxiety. And he says that we are restless people who occasionally find rest. And here's my short message today. I believe the occasional moments that we find rest comes through a means of practicing silence and solitude. When we go into the rhythm of practicing silence and solitude, it gives us a means to actually find rest. It gives us a means to actually be content and satisfied and fulfilled. Here's my one point today before we go into our potluck. The reason why silence and solitude is so important is because it helps us be present. Silence and solitude gives us the gift of being present. The reason why most of us have discontentment in our hearts is because our minds and our emotions are either living in the future or living in the past. Our minds and our hearts are restless because we're living in the past, our regrets. I can't believe I snapped on my wife. I can't believe I watched this. I can't believe I did so bad at work. I can't believe I failed my exam. I can't believe I got fired. I can't believe. Or it's, I can't wait till this happens. My life might suck now, but I know in the future I'm going to have so-and-so. And what that does is it creates dissatisfaction. It creates discontentment. But the practice of silence and solitude, when you quiet down, it gives you the grace to be present. It gives you the grace to be where you are. And this is what happens when you are present. You either feel two emotions. You either grieve or you're grateful. I've noticed that many of us are so busybody and so distracted on social media because it's too much to deal with our pain. It's actually too much to deal with what's happening inside of us. But there is a gift in grieving. There is a gift in crying. I know for some of us today, the holidays are actually not a season to be grateful. For many of us, it's a season to grieve. It's to actually say, my family is broken. My Thanksgiving meal is extremely awkward. We've had things that happen, but usually what do? We just go through the motions. We just go through it. But actually the invitation is to feel that. It's to bring that before God. It's to actually cry in the presence of God. I think one of the most beautiful things that Jesus ever showed his disciples was not healing the sick, it's not casting out demons, but it's showing them his tears. When he saw Jerusalem in a day of feasting, while everybody was celebrating, he was actually grieving. Because he saw that they missed the Messiah. And it says that Jesus cried over Jerusalem. When he saw one of his best friends, Lazarus, died, Jesus actually begins to weep. He begins to cry. So my invitation to us today is as we go into the practice of silence and solitude, I want to give you the permission to grieve. To maybe this holiday is different. Last year I was with my parents. This year they're not coming. Something happened in our family this past year, and there's just, I can't invite my uncle and my cousins. I want you to feel that, and it's okay. On the other side, it's also a space to let gratitude intensify. Do you know what I've noticed when I practice silence and solitude? It deepens my grief, but it also deepens my gratefulness. I get so excited sometimes, I get so happy, and I just move on like Will Smith. He celebrated for 15 seconds. Yo, number one. Why didn't we hit 80 million? And what Silence and Solitude does is I'm grateful for the season, and then when I sit in quiet, it just goes deeper and deeper into my heart. Instead of moving on to the next thing, breathe it in. Breathe it in. Practice gratitude through silence and solitude by letting it intensify. Amen? Hey, that's it for y'all today. I think I did 15 minutes. So I'm going to pray for the food. And my wife's going to come up, and my wife and I, we're going to try to host this to the best of our ability. And we're going to have a great, great meal and have some activities prepared for us this morning. If you can't close our eyes.